Hello everybody, welcome to week 9 of the course. I hope everybody had a good 4th of July. It's the next to the last week of the course. It's kind of hard to believe things have been going by pretty quickly. Couple announcements. First, we have a quiz, our last quiz, coming up this week. I'll post it on Friday, and it'll be due on Saturday as usual. Also, not this Friday, but the next Friday, your final research proposals are due. So, and as I said, I'm willing to look at drafts. If you guys want to send me one, I ask that you send it to me by this Friday if you want me to look at your draft and comment on it. So if you can get it to me by this Friday, I'll have a look at it, and I'll send you some comments on it before it's due next week. The final thing to say is that just remember that the participation in the discussions is worth 15% of your final grade. So, make sure these last couple of weeks that you're really getting in there and you're participating in those discussions. If you have missed some weeks along the way, I encourage you to go back to those discussions that you missed and post. I won't give you full credit for it because it'll be late, but it will be better than not getting any credit at all. So just make sure that you're participating by answering my question and responding to one of your classmates. Also, student evaluations I think are going to open up pretty soon. So if you guys don't mind, I'd appreciate it if you would conduct an evaluation of the course. If you have any feedback that you want to send me, that would be fine too. So okay, so last week there was a lot of reading material. It was chapters 8 and chapter 9. Both were on research methods specifically, which I guess is what you guys thought the entire class would be about. Who knew that to do research method you had to do all this theory and background, right? But there's a lot that goes into it. So yeah, I mean, obviously I can't cover in this short video every quantitative and qualitative research method, but I just wanted to give you guys a general overview. So in the future, when you're carrying out research projects, you'll have a better idea of which questions lend themselves better to quantitative methods, which questions lend themselves better to qualitative methods. Do you have a preference for one or the other? And if you do decide to do one of those, then you'll, quantitative or qualitative, you may know which specific methodology within those that you want to utilize. And also having a better understanding of these methods will help you as you're reading other, studies and other papers. You'll have a better understanding of how an experiment works, how participant observation works, what an ethnography is, things like that. Okay, so quantitative methods. Creswell, I think one thing I will say is I think the introduction that Creswell gives in the beginning of chapter 8, I think it's the first paragraph of the introduction, is really an outstanding description of quantitative methodology and the philosophy behind quantitative studies. And he starts out by saying that quantitative methods are coming out of this sort of positivism philosophy, which essentially kind of ties to the scientific method, which believes that there is sort of an external world out there, and then if we approach learning about that world in the correct way or in a scientific way, we can say things that are objectively true about the world, right? So that's sort of the positivist mentality, and it's very focused on this notion of cause and effect. That's that's essentially what quantitative studies are trying to do. They're trying to predict, what the causes are of certain phenomena that exist in the world. So essentially, he talked about two different types of quantitative methods. One was the survey, which is the one I'll spend the most time on. It's the most popular, at least in the social sciences. And the other is experiment, which I'll touch on briefly. Okay, so he says that when you're doing a survey, what you're trying to do, I think his exact definition was you're trying to provide a numeric description of an attitude or trend or opinion about a particular phenomenon. Okay, so that's the sort of the general description or definition of a survey. And, we're all sort of familiar with what a survey is. We get all the calls from the telemarketers and the political organizations and all that who want us to conduct surveys, right? Essentially, it's a list of questions that are designed to measure, your attitudes, your opinions on certain, certain political positions, certain products, in social sciences, certain social classes and conditions and things like that. So how do these surveys actually go out, right? There are lots of different ways that they can go out. Oftentimes it'll be somebody, will send you something in the mail, or these days more likely something on the internet, an email. A lot of times when you call, a bank or cell phone company or whatever, they'll ask you at the end, do you want to stay online and take this brief survey, right? So those are sort of the self-administered ones, but there can be sort of structured interviews, right, where somebody will actually come out and meet with you face to face, and they will ask you the questions, and then you'll respond. So it's not self-administered; it's just sort of more interactional. Okay, so what are we trying to do, right? So let's say that we want to know how the population of the United States feels about the Affordable Care Act, right, or something, so let's say the Supreme Court's recent decision regarding the Affordable Care Act. So we have our population, right? That's something that you need to understand, the difference between a population and a sample. So in the survey, we want to understand how the United States population feels about the Supreme Court's decision regarding Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. But obviously, if we want to do our survey, it's not going to be easy for us or even possible, perhaps, to survey every single person in the United States within that population, right? So what do we have to do? We have to take a sample. And so that means that we're taking a small percentage of that larger population, and those are the people that we're going to try to survey, right? So the deal is, what you want to do, because there's a statistical theory that says that if you choose the right sample from a particular larger population, you can take the results from that smaller sample and you can apply it more generally to that entire population. So that's essentially what a survey is designed to do, is to find the correct sample from a population, survey that sample, and then apply those results to that larger population. Now, how do you do that, right? So the deal is, you're supposed to do a random sample, right? There are certain random sampling techniques that you can utilize to make sure that you're getting the right sample from your population that will enable you to make those larger generalizations. There's something else that you can do as well, which is actually most surveys, at least most social science surveys, conduct this, where they do something called stratification. And that's where they take, even within that population, let's say American citizens, right? Maybe you want to stratify, your survey or your survey results by different demographics. So Caucasian, African American, male, female. You're stratifying your survey results by different categories, like gender or race, or maybe veteran status, something like that, because you want to see if there are trends within those different demographics that may tell you something interesting. Like, for instance, you may see within the Asian American category of citizens that they support the Supreme Court's decision regarding Obamacare more than, let's say Caucasians or something like that, right? So you see sort of these interesting trends below the surface on that. But sometimes, so random sampling is obviously, that's the gold standard of doing surveys, but sometimes you can't, you just can't do it, right? And that's when you have to take something called a convenience sample, which essentially means you just sample whatever part of the population that you actually can get easy access to, right? And of course, that brings into question this whole idea of generalizability, right? It's a lot harder to make an argument that you can generalize if you're doing a convenience sample rather than a random sample. Okay, so there are three, and I've already talked about this a little bit, but there are three sort of categories that you need to think about, not just within surveys, but certainly within quantitative and qualitative research. And those are validity, reliability, and generalizability, right? So validity just means, and Creswell sort of gives he gives a definition of validity for quantitative and qualitative, but validity means that your study is constructed in such a way that it measures what you set out to measure, right? And that the results that you get from your particular study are legitimate. So it's a little bit confusing because it's not the results themselves that are valid, right? It's the study. It's the way that the study is constructed is what's valid, and that's what makes the information useful, right? So there are all these procedures that you can undertake within the construction of your study to make sure that your data is going to be useful, right, or legitimate, right? And he talks about, there are these different types of validity. There's construct validity, which means that you're sort of measuring the concepts in the correct way. You're utilizing the concepts within your study in the correct way. There's content validity, which is specifically about making sure that your study is measuring exactly what it's meant to measure, right? And he also talks about some of the different threats to validity. And he talked about these specifically with experiments, but you can also apply them to surveys as well, right? So they're internal threats to validity, right? So maybe the way that you conducted your sampling procedures, or the population that you decided to target, right? There's something about the way your study was designed that calls into question the validity of that particular study. But there can also be external threats to validity as well. Perhaps some sort of historical event happens in the middle of your study. Let's say you're conducting a study on American attitudes towards the Middle East, right? And let's say that during the middle of your study, 9/11 happened, right? That's an external threat to the validity of your study. So that's going to call into question your results. Okay, let's see. Okay, so I guess that's a decent intro to surveys. Experiment, I'll give you a brief example. We all sort of have an idea of the way an experiment works, right? Now, perhaps the easiest way to think about it is like when they're testing out a new drug, right? So you have your treatment, which, let's say, for instance, this is the drug that you're treating. Let's say, I can't even think of the name of the drug that they use to help you sleep, right? But let's whatever that is, it'll probably come to me. The drug that they use to help you sleep, right? They want to test that out, right? So the treatment in that particular case is that drug. I'm still trying to think of it. It's driving me crazy. But you have two different groups, right? So you have your control group and you have your test group, right? So you have two different groups of people. And one group of the people are going to get sort of the placebo, and the other are going to get this actual this drug, right? So you have your control, you have your treatment, and then you have your actual test group, right? So they give the drug to the test group, they give it to the control group, and they see if there are any differences between between the two groups, right? Was the drug effective in helping people sleep? So that's essentially the way that an experiment works. A lot of the same things hold true. For as far as sampling goes, trying to get a random sample. If you want to generalize to a larger population, making sure you're getting a random sample for your experiment as well. Sometimes you have to purposefully select for an experiment. Perhaps you're focusing on people who have sleep problems, or maybe your drug is focused on people with sleep apnea, right? So you have to deal with people who have sleep apnea. So there's a certain amount of purposefulness to the selection of your sample for an experiment that may not be the case for a survey quite as much. Which brings me back, I forgot, I was talking about validity, reliability, and generalizability. So I talked a little bit about validity. Reliability just means that your study is consistent, right? It means that if I go out and I conduct a survey today, on people's attitudes regarding Americans' attitudes regarding the Supreme Court decision on Affordable Care Act, that means that you could go out and conduct the same survey, and ideally, if my study were reliable, it would mean that you would get the same results. If you asked the exact same questions that I asked, you would get the exact same data that I got, right? Or, ideally, and of course this brings into question the external factor, external threats, but, somebody could go out next week and conduct the survey and get the same results. Would mean that the study is reliable. Generalizable just means that you can take the results from that particular sample and apply it to the larger population, and that's the gold standard of what we're looking for in quantitative research. We're trying to take the numerical results from this small sample and generalize to the larger population and make theories about predictions about why things are and what causes things to happen the way that they happen. So that's just a very brief primer on quantitative. So qualitative is very different, right? You're not coming out of that positivist mentality that there are objective truths about the social world, and if we apply the scientific method, we can get at them, right? Qualitative philosophies disagree with that. Mostly, they're coming out of sort of social constructionist theories that say that social reality is constructed. It means different things to different people. There is no one truth about the way society is set up or the way that society functions, but it depends upon your perspective in a lot of ways. So you can see right away, it diverges quite a bit from what the quantitative methods are trying to do, right? And there, he talked about certain hallmarks of qualitative research, right? So one is that it should happen in a natural setting, whereas you contrast that to quantitative. Oftentimes, quantitative results are done in a controlled area, right? So if it's an experiment, it's going to be done in a lab. Contrast that with an ethnography, where rather than going into a lab, you actually go into a village, or a hospital or whatever, and you're going into that setting and you're seeing the way that the participants react within that setting. So saying that you're going to get a more, I hate to use the word truthful, but you're going to get a more perhaps insightful perspective by seeing the way that certain people's realities, are, happening within that particular setting. The role of the researcher is very different, right? And in quantitative study, the researcher is supposed to be, as unbiased as possible, not bringing their values into the study. The researcher is not the instrument in quantitative studies. The instrument that you're using to measure, your results in quantitative studies are the survey itself or the experiment, right? But in qualitative research, the instrument is actually the researcher, because you're the person who's making using your judgment to, report these results from this particular study. Right, so the researcher plays a much different role, and as such, the researcher's values and biases actually come into the research much more. So you're not even really supposed to be approaching this from sort of a non-biased, value-free perspective, but rather, qualitative research says that the values that the researcher holds plays a large role in the way that the study actually plays out. Multiple forms of data, right? So mostly with qualitative research, we're dealing with textual data, we're dealing with images, Whereas with quantitative, you're primarily just working with numbers. But this, it could be, it could be interview data, it could be observational data, it could be audio-visual data these days, right? A lot's done with video. And oftentimes all these things are combined together, right? So maybe you're using your interviews with your observations with a certain newspaper that was published or a newsletter that was published by a group that you're studying or something like that. And you're combining these different multiple forms of data, right? And you're trying to sort of weave them together, kind of like a quilt. And you're trying to say, okay, well, here's what I found out in my interview, and I saw this, and I have this newsletter, and these things all sort of like triangulate, right, to point me to my key observation on this particular question. It's an inductive form of analysis, meaning that you're working from the bottom up. Like you make observation A, you make observation B, and you're seeing that along the way as you go through your study, you're seeing that these things are starting to work towards perhaps a conclusion or a point. Whereas quantitative analysis is deductive analysis, which means you're starting with some sort of general theory or some sort of general proposition, and you're seeing what you can derive. So rather than it being bottom up, deductive quantitative analysis is top down. So because you're not, in qualitative, you're not starting with a theory or you're not starting with a hypothesis about the way things are, right? You're starting at the bottom saying, I don't really know how things are, so I need to make this observation to try to build that theory. Whereas in quantitative, you're starting with a theory and you're trying to say, okay, well, what can I discern? If this is true, then what can I discern about why this is true? And yeah, it's the emergent design, right? That's something else that's very different with qualitative, is that you can hear my daughter crying over there. So it's emergent design, right? So we don't have a tightly controlled idea of the way that the experiment is going to unfold. We realize that because we don't have all the requisite information, we can't script out everything that's going to happen. So we have to be willing to sort of adapt our plan on the fly. If we're studying this and we think this is the reason, and something emerges that says, oh, okay, well, I'm looking at completely wrong thing. So you have to change tack a bit to keep your study going in the right direction. Methods, already talked about these a bit. There's observation, which is ethnography primarily, right? So remember that so it's confusing because we have designs, which quantitative, qualitative, mixed. We have strategies of inquiry, which are sort of the different philosophies that we bring to it, which in qualitative are ethnography, case study, grounded theory, narrative phenomenology, these sorts of things. And then within those strategies, we have the methods themselves. And the methods are like observation, participant or non-participant observation, interviews, semi-structured, structured, oral histories. Let's see, what else? Yeah, document content analysis, right? So there are all these different methods that are available to us within the qualitative realm. So, and oftentimes, as we talked about, the hallmark with quantitative methodology and quantitative studies being generalizability, trying to see what we can apply to the larger population. Oftentimes, and I think Creswell mentions this, the goal perhaps of qualitative research is not generalizability, but rather particularity, right? So we're not trying to generalize to the larger population, but we're trying to achieve a deeper understanding of what happens in a particular space at a particular level, which of course is completely consistent with this notion that there is no one general truth in society, but rather there are multiple truths. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand these multiple truths rather than arriving at one, large truth, right? So I think that's it for research methods. I mean, obviously, we could spend an entire semester talking about this, but hopefully that's enough to just sort of clarify any questions you guys might have had during the reading. I made some comments in the discussions So hopefully that helped as well. If you guys have any further questions about any of the methods or validity, reliability, generalizability, all that stuff, post it on the course questions website first, and then you can also, if that's not satisfactory, you can email me as well. Don't forget that quiz 4 will be on Friday, our last quiz. Research proposal due not this Friday but next Friday. So if you want me to look at a draft, send it to me by Friday. And yeah, this week we're looking at mixed methods. Last chapter in Creswell, so we're almost through Creswell. And I will post, I don't think I've posted yet, but I will post the little segment on interdisciplinarity for next week. All right, hope you guys have a great week. If you have any questions, let me know.